The last good day began with the scent of damp earth and the promise of altitude. Ethan Hayes, a man who found more truth in the rings of a tree than in any book, inhaled deeply. He was a botanist, but that title felt too clinical, too sterile for the devotion he felt. He was more of a whisperer to the woods, a cartographer of chlorophyll. At 42, his face was a pleasant map of its own, creased by sun and smiling, his hands calloused from work but gentle in their touch. His competence was a quiet, steady thing. He could identify a fern by the pattern of its spores, predict a storm by the curl of a leaf, and navigate by the slant of the sun through the dense canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains. This particular expedition was a personal pilgrimage, a quest to document the elusive Painted Trillium in a remote, a high-elevation cove he'd spent months triangulating from old survey maps and satellite imagery. It was his cathedral, and he was bringing his daughter to worship. Lily, at 6 years old, was his echo, a small, bright vulnerability he carried with him like a second heart. She had his curious eyes and a spirit that vibrated with the same frequency as the wilderness. Their bond was woven from shared discoveries, the iridescent shell of a beetle, the velvety texture of moss, the hollow knock of a woodpecker. He had taught her the names of the trees, not just as labels, but as introductions to old friends. "This is Liriodendron tulipifera," he'd murmur, his hand on the furrowed bark of a tulip poplar. "She's the queen of the cove." Lily would press her small palm flat against the trunk, as if feeling for a pulse. Today, she was a flash of pink and purple against the deep greens and browns of the trail, a tiny backpack containing a juice box, a half-eaten bag of gummy bears, and a small, hand-carved wooden bird he'd made for her, its surface worn smooth by the constant travel in her pocket. Around noon they reached a scenic overlook, a break in the trees framing a breathtaking panorama of ridges folding into one another, veiled in the park's signature blue haze. This was the moment. He knelt, framing the shot with his phone. Lily stood, beaming, her 2 front teeth proudly missing, the vast ancient mountains sprawling behind her like a sleeping giant. He snapped the photo, then turned the phone around to take one of them together, his arm around her small shoulders, her head tucked against his chest. He typed a quick message to his wife, Sarah. "Found our spot. Queen of the Cove sends her love. Home for dinner?" He hit send, the single bar of service flickering before the message icon showed a satisfying "delivered." In their kitchen, miles away, Sarah's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen, a warm smile spreading across her face. It was a perfect picture of her 2 favorite people in their favorite place. She set the phone down, the image of their smiling faces a comforting glow on the screen, and returned to kneading dough for the evening's pizza, the scent of yeast and contentment filling the room. It was 12:47 p.m. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, slanting golden through the kitchen window. Sarah shaped the pizza dough, her movements practiced and easy. 5:30 p.m. They were usually back by now, muddy and triumphant. She rationalized. Ethan had probably found a particularly fascinating patch of galax leaves or gotten into a deep, one-sided conversation with a Fraser fir. He operated on mountain time, a fluid concept governed by light and discovery, not the rigid march of a kitchen clock. 6:15 p.m. She slid the pizzas into the hot oven. The smell of baking cheese and tomato sauce filled the house. A pang of annoyance, soft and familiar, pricked at her. He'd lost track of time again. His phone was probably dead. She pictured them emerging from the trailhead, Lily asleep on his shoulders, both of them blissfully unaware of the perfectly crisping pizza crust awaiting them. 7 p.m. The pizza was out of the oven, cooling on the counter. The sun had dipped below the nearest ridge, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She picked up her phone, his picture still on the screen, and called him. It went straight to voicemail. Hey, it's me. Pizza's getting cold. Hope you guys are heading back. Call me. Her voice was light, but a thread of something else, something tight and cold, was weaving itself into the fabric of the evening. She began to pace the length of the kitchen, her bare feet cold on the linoleum. With each pass, the rationalizations grew thinner, more transparent. A twisted ankle, a wrong turn on the trail, easily corrected, a dead car battery. Each possibility was a flimsy shield against a darker, formless dread that was beginning to coalesce in the pit of her stomach. At 8:30 p.m., with the sky now a deep, starless black, the shield shattered. The image of Lily, so small against the vastness of the mountains, flashed in her mind, no longer comforting, but terrifying. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was a roaring, predatory void. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone again, her thumb hovering over the 3 numbers she had prayed she would never have to dial. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the crushing silence. She took a breath that felt like swallowing glass and made the call. 911, what is your emergency? The voice was calm, professional. Sarah's voice, when it finally came out, was a ragged whisper, the sound of a world breaking. My husband and my daughter, they went hiking in the Smokies. They're not back. The response was not a trickle, but a flood. Within hours, the trailhead parking lot at the base of the mountain transformed into a bustling, temporary city of purpose and grim determination. It was an army assembling to fight a ghost. White National Park Service trucks and olive drab vehicles from the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency parked in neat rows under the cold, humming glare of portable light towers. The air, thick with the smell of pine and damp leaf litter, was now layered with the acrid bite of diesel exhaust and the scent of strong black coffee brewing in industrial-sized urns. A large RV, bristling with antennas, became the incident command post, its interior a hive of radio chatter and the soft glow of laptop screens displaying topographical maps. Seasoned search and rescue veterans from a dozen different agencies across 3 states arrived, their faces etched with the quiet competence of people who knew the mountains and their cruel indifference. They spoke in a clipped, professional shorthand, their movements efficient as they checked gear, unfurled maps, and organized into teams. The scale of the mobilization was staggering, a testament to the unspoken rule of the wilderness. When a child is lost, you bring everything. The methodology of the search was a science applied to chaos. Inside the command post, the lead investigator, a veteran park ranger named Dave Ballard, with a face like a worn slab of granite, sectioned the vast search area into a precise grid overlaid on a massive topo map. Each square, a slice of impossibly dense terrain, was assigned to a team. On the ground, this translated into grueling, painstaking work. Teams of 4 or 5 called flankers moved in long lines through the undergrowth, their eyes scanning a designated 5-foot lane. They battled through what the locals called rhododendron hells, tangled, interlocking thickets of rhododendron and mountain laurel so dense they had to crawl on their hands and knees, the branches whipping at their faces and snagging their clothes. K-9 units were deployed at first light, the dogs straining at their leashes, their powerful noses sampling the air for a scent trail, but the Smokies were a forensic nightmare. The thick canopy blocked satellite signals, rendering GPS units unreliable. The damp ground and frequent scattered showers washed away scent and footprints within hours. The terrain itself was a labyrinth of steep ravines, hidden waterfalls, and thickets that could swallow a person whole just 10 feet from a marked trail. Drones buzzed overhead at dawn and dusk, their thermal cameras searching for the faint heat signature of a human body. But the dense foliage created a blanket that masked everything below. The army was disciplined, equipped, and expert, but their enemy was the wilderness itself, an entity with no battle lines, no strategy, and infinite places to hide its secrets. For a volunteer named Mark, a contractor from Knoxville on his seventh search, the third day was a blur of aching muscles and mounting frustration. He was assigned to a grid section that was a near vertical slope of loose shale and tangled briars. Every step was a calculation of risk. The air was heavy and humid, and sweat soaked through his shirt, mingling with the dirt and the small bleeding scratches that covered his arms. The mantra of the searcher played on a loop in his head: person, place, thing. Look for anything out of place. A scrap of fabric, a dropped water bottle, a broken branch that didn't look right. But everything was in its place. The forest was a perfect, unbroken tapestry of green and brown. Twice his heart leaped. Once for a discarded granola bar wrapper, which turned out to be years old and half decomposed, and once for a flash of pink in the undergrowth that revealed itself to be a cluster of lady slipper orchids. Each false alarm was a small, sharp stab of disappointment. By midday, a weary resignation had settled over his team. They were not finding clues. They were just walking, pushing through a wilderness that felt profoundly, unnervingly empty. It was like searching a locked room for something that was never there to begin with. The silence of the woods, usually a comfort to him, felt mocking. Sarah existed in a state of suspended animation at the command post. The world had shrunk to this gravel lot, to the smells of mud and exhaustion. She sat on a folding chair near the command RV, a styrofoam cup of coffee grown cold in her hands. She had given Ranger Ballard everything she could think of. The photo from Ethan's phone, which allowed them to pinpoint his last known location with chilling accuracy. Detailed printouts of the maps Ethan had been studying, covered in his familiar spidery handwriting. A description of their clothes, their gear, even the specific brand of Lily's purple backpack. Ballard was patient and kind. His deep voice, a steady presence in the swirling chaos of her fear. He explained the search grids, the probability statistics, the deployment of the dog teams. But the technical jargon was a foreign language describing the search for her entire world. She watched the searchers return at dusk, their faces smeared with dirt, their shoulders slumped with the weight of another day of finding nothing. They avoided her eyes, not out of unkindness, but because they had no news to give, and the absence of news was a physical weight they all shared. Inside, she was a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. She wanted to scream, to run into the woods herself, to claw at the dirt. But she also clung to the order of the command post, the methodical procedures, the quiet professionalism. It was the only thing holding the terror at bay. She was a spectator at the most important event of her life, a passive, waiting heart around which this massive, futile machine churned. On the morning of the fifth day, and a crack of light broke through the gloom. A search team, working a difficult section along the west prong of the Little Pigeon River, miles from Ethan's intended route, found something. Lodged in the roots of a sycamore tree at the water's edge, tangled with flood debris, was a small, tattered piece of fabric. It was a pink ribbon, the kind used to tie back a little girl's hair. The call came over the radio, and a wave of tense, focused energy surged through the command post. The team leader bagged the ribbon as evidence, his voice tight with adrenaline as he described the location. It was a dangerous stretch of river known for its powerful currents and deep, hidden pools, especially after a rain. A new theory, swift and terrible, took hold. It was a narrative that made a grim, logical sense. Ethan and Lily had become disoriented. Or perhaps they'd missed a turn or were trying a shortcut. They ended up far from their planned trail, and following the oldest rule of the lost, decided to follow water downstream. In this treacherous terrain, it was easy to imagine what happened next. A small slip. Lily, exhausted and unsteady, falls into the fast-moving, frigid water. Ethan, without a second's hesitation, goes in after her. The theory spread through the search teams and was gently, carefully explained to Sarah by Ranger Ballard. It was horrific, but it was also a scenario, a concrete story to replace the formless terror of the unknown. For the first time in days, there was a path forward. A surge of dreadful hope electrified the operation. Hope not for a happy ending, but for an ending at all, for recovery, for certainty. The operational focus shifted with stunning speed. The meticulous grid search in the high country, which had yielded nothing, was scaled back. Resources were reallocated, pouring into the river valley. Swiftwater rescue teams from 3 states, clad in dry suits and helmets, arrived with inflatable rafts. Kayakers, experts at navigating Class 4 rapids, were deployed to search the eddies and strainers where the current was most likely to deposit something. Teams on foot began a grim, methodical sweep of the riverbanks, extending for miles downstream, their eyes scanning the tangled roots and debris piles. For 3 solid days, the river became the sole focus. Divers, tethered by ropes, braved the murky, bone-chilling water to explore the deepest pools. The search was painstaking, dangerous, and emotionally brutal. Sarah was moved to a different waiting area, away from the river, shielded from the direct view of the divers and their grim task. She was told to prepare for the worst, and in the strange calculus of grief, the prospect of finding them, even like this, felt like a form of rescue. The debunking came not with a bang, but with a quiet, administrative click of a computer mouse. On the evening of the 8th day, as the river search was winding down with no results, a junior park ranger back at the main office was tasked with cross-referencing the found item with old incident reports. It was standard procedure, a box to be checked. He entered the description. Pink hair ribbon, found West Prong, Little Pigeon River. A hit came up, an incident report from 4 years prior. A family of tourists had reported their 9-year-old daughter briefly missing near that same stretch of river. She had been found an hour later, safe but frightened, hiding in the woods. She had lost a hair ribbon. The description was a perfect match. A quick call to the family, who now lived in Ohio, confirmed it. They even had photos of their daughter from that day wearing the identical ribbon. The news landed at the command post like a physical blow. The ribbon wasn't Lily's. The entire river theory, the focus of the last 72 hours of intense, back-breaking effort, was built on a coincidence. The hope, as fragile as it was, shattered into a million pieces. The air went out of the operation. The next morning, Ranger Ballard sat with Sarah, his face haggard. The official search was being suspended. They had exhausted every lead, every possibility. The army was retreating, leaving the ghost undisturbed in the mountains. For Sarah, the crushing weight of this finality was heavier than any discovery would have been. It was the beginning of a silence that would stretch for years, a void filled only by the echoes of a single terrible question. How can 2 people, a man and a child, simply vanish from the face of the earth? 7 years passed. The world spun on, seasons cycling through the Smokies with indifferent beauty. The snows of winter blanketed the peaks, melting into the riotous green of spring. Summer brought the thick haze and the drone of cicadas, followed by the fiery spectacle of autumn. For the public, the story of Ethan and Lily Hayes faded from a front-page tragedy to a cautionary tale, then to a piece of local folklore. Now another sad ghost story whispered around campfires. They became a statistic, 2 more souls claimed by the immensity of the wilderness. But for Sarah, time had not moved forward. It had frozen on that last good day, trapping her in an endless autumn afternoon. Her home, once filled with light and laughter, had become a quiet, meticulously organized archive of grief. The world moved on, but she remained a solitary lighthouse keeper, her beam fixed on a patch of ocean where a ship had gone down, refusing to believe it was truly lost. A false narrative had calcified into accepted truth. Fueled by early speculative news reports and the ultimate failure of the search, the consensus was that Ethan, for all his expertise, had been reckless. He was cast as the arrogant idealist who overestimated his abilities and underestimated the mountains. in dragging his innocent daughter to her doom. A tragic but preventable accident, one newspaper column had concluded, a stark reminder that the wilderness does not suffer fools. This narrative was a separate, ongoing torment for Sarah. It desecrated the memory of the most careful and competent man she had ever known. It was a lie she could not let stand. Her fight against the false story was her reason for breathing. The guest bedroom had been converted into a war room. The walls were covered in topographical maps of the park, crisscrossed with lines of colored string marking search grids, potential routes, and areas of interest. Filing cabinets overflowed with documents, copies of the entire official search report, which she had obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, witness statements, news clippings, and her own voluminous notes. This was not the chaotic den of a grieving obsessive. It was the highly organized office of a lead investigator who refused to close the case. One Tuesday afternoon, she was on the phone, her voice calm and firm, speaking to the now retired Ranger Ballard. "Dave, I'm looking at the initial K9 report from day one again. Handler notes say the dogs lost the scent 300 yards up the trail near that old chestnut oak. They showed interest in the road, then nothing. It never made sense. Why would they go back to the road?" Ballard's voice on the other end was weary, kind, but tinged with the finality she had come to despise. "Sarah, we went over this. A gust of wind, a passing animal. A scent trail can be a fickle thing." She hung up, not angry, but with a familiar, cold resolve. She turned to her computer and opened the website she had built from scratch, findethanandlily.com. She uploaded a new post, a detailed analysis of the K9 reports, methodically debunking the official explanation. She attached photos of Ethan on other hikes, pictures of his carefully packed survival kits, excerpts from his journals detailing his meticulous planning. She was fighting a ghost story with facts, battling a shrug of public indifference with the sheer relentless force of her certainty. This was her vigil. In the quiet hours of the night when the fight subsided, the complexity of her emotional state would surface. The grief was a low, constant hum, the background radiation of her life. But the hope was a different animal entirely. It was not a soft, gentle thing. It was sharp, demanding, and at times agonizing. And it was the conviction, born from the absolute lack of a single shred of evidence, that the official story was wrong. No backpack, no clothing, no footprints, no remains. Vanishing was not a natural process. Ethan and Lily had not been erased by the wilderness. They had been removed. This belief was her sanctuary and her torment. Some nights she would allow herself to wonder if she was delusional, if her refusal to accept the unacceptable was a form of madness. She would look at the picture on her nightstand, the last picture of her husband and daughter smiling against the blue haze, and the doubt would recede. The truth was not in the mountains. The truth was somewhere else, and she was the only one left looking for it. Her hope was not a passive waiting. It was an active, unyielding investigation, a promise she had made to the smiling faces in the photograph. 7 years after Ethan and Lily Hayes became ghosts, two people walked into a place they were not supposed to be. Chloe, a graduate student in geology with a passion for obscure rock formations, and her boyfriend Ben, an amateur photographer with an eye for dramatic landscapes, were deep in a remote, trailless section of the park. They were hunting for a specific type of pegmatite intrusion that, according to a 1930s geological survey map, was located in a steep, unnamed gully far from any designated path. They were young, fit, and possessed the particular brand of confident recklessness that comes with specialized knowledge. They believed they knew the mountains well enough to break the rules. The gully was treacherous, a steep chute of loose scree, on moss-covered boulders and tangled roots. It was clear that no human had passed this way in a very long time. As Ben scrambled down a particularly unstable section, his foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves. He threw his right hand out to brace himself against the rocky slope. His weight dislodged a section of soil and small rocks that had been held in place by a network of roots. The small landslide tumbled for a few feet before settling. Where Ben's hand had been, a dark shape was now visible, wedged tightly in a crevice between two large, immovable boulders. "Whoa, look at this," he said, brushing away more dirt. It was a piece of outdoor gear, caked in years of mud and leaf mold. Chloe scrambled down beside him. It was a GPS unit, a high-end Garmin, the kind serious backcountry explorers used. Its casing was cracked and deeply scratched. The screen shattered. It had clearly been there for a very long time, but the crevice had offered it some protection from the worst of the elements. They pried it loose. It felt heavy, solid, a piece of lost equipment most likely, but the location was deeply strange. This wasn't a popular hiking area. It was a place you had to actively seek out and with difficulty. Why would someone be using a GPS here? And why would it be so deliberately wedged into a crack? "We should probably just leave it," Ben said, turning it over in his hands. "It's junk." Chloe hesitated. As a geologist, she was trained to observe anomalies, things that didn't fit the natural order. A piece of advanced technology buried in a forgotten ravine felt like a significant anomaly. "I don't know," she said slowly. It just feels weird, like it was hidden, not just dropped." The debate was brief. The feeling of wrongness was too strong to ignore. They carefully wrapped the battered device in a spare jacket and put it in Chloe's pack. The journey back to the car was more arduous than the journey in. The GPS unit seemed to gain weight with every step, a dense, solid question mark in her backpack. They drove to the Sugarlands Visitor Center, feeling slightly foolish. They walked up to the ranger station, where a young, fresh-faced ranger with a neatly trimmed beard was answering questions for a family of tourists. When they finally had his attention, Ben placed the muddy GPS on the counter. We found this," he said, "way off trail in a gully west of Chimney Tops." The ranger, whose name tag read T. in Jensen, picked it up with a practiced air of faint boredom. He saw dozens of pieces of lost property every season. "All right, thanks for turning it in. I'll log it in the book." He started to turn away. "Wait," Chloe said. "It was really buried, and the serial number on the back is still legible." Jensen paused. Something in her tone, a seriousness that went beyond finding a lost water bottle, made him stop. He sighed, then took the device and turned it over. He typed the serial number into his computer, navigating to the park's cold case database, more to placate them than anything else. He clicked search. A file popped up on his screen, a file flagged in red. Case number 734-NPS, missing persons Ethan and Lily Hayes. Date of incident October 14th, 7 years ago. Under the list of missing personal effects provided by the victim's wife, was one entry. Garmin, GPS MAP 64ST, serial number 2L80345591. The number on his screen matched the number on the device in his hand. The air in the ranger station suddenly felt thick and cold. Ranger Jensen looked up from his screen, his young face pale. The ghost had just handed him a business card. The battered Garmin was sealed in an evidence bag and sent via courier not to a local lab, but directly to the FBI's elite hostage rescue team and crisis negotiation unit's facility in Quantico, Virginia. Its destination was the sub-basement laboratory of Dr. Anya Sharma, a forensic scientist who was as much a digital archaeologist as a chemist. Her lab was a sterile sanctuary of gleaming stainless steel, humming air purifiers and microscopes powerful enough to see the history of the world in a grain of sand. Dr. Sharma, a woman with intense, dark eyes and a preternatural calm, specialized in extracting data from the dead, damaged phones, burned hard drives, and, in this case, a GPS unit that had been entombed in the wilderness for 7 years. She placed the device under a fume hood and began the painstaking process of disassembly, her gloved hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. Her initial goal was to recover data from the memory chip, but the water damage was extensive. While a secondary process worked on that, she turned her attention to the physical evidence, the dirt, the grime, the microscopic detritus trapped within the device's casing. She was particularly interested in the battery compartment, which, though not perfectly sealed, had been compressed shut, trapping a small amount of sediment. She carefully scraped this material onto a slide. Under a scanning electron microscope, the tiny grains of dirt resolved into a miniature world of minerals, insect fragments, and, most importantly, pollen. Pollen grains were nature's fingerprints, their unique shapes and resilience making them invaluable forensic markers. Dr. Sharma began the meticulous process of identifying them. The sample was dominated by two types, Picea rubens, red spruce, and Abies fraseri, Fraser fir. This was a distinct and powerful clue. The spruce fir ecosystem in the Great Smoky Mountains exists only at the highest elevations, typically above 4,500 feet. It is a remnant of the last ice age, a cool, damp, Canadian-style forest clinging to the peaks, a world away from the deciduous hardwoods of the lower slopes. The pollen told her, with scientific certainty, that this GPS unit had spent a significant amount of time in a high-altitude spruce fir forest. Then she cross-referenced this with the discovery location. The gully where the geology students had found the device was at an elevation of 2,800 feet. Its vegetation was classic Appalachian cove hardwood, tulip poplar, yellow birch, American beech. More critically, she pulled up a hydrological map of the park. The gully was part of a watershed that flowed south, its origins thousands of feet below and miles away from the nearest spruce fir zone. It was a physical impossibility. Water flows downhill, pollen and sediment wash downhill. The GPS could not have washed down from a spruce fir forest to the hardwood cove where it was found. It was a paradox. The moment of discovery was quiet, internal. Dr. R. Sharma stared at the two maps on her dual monitors. The NPS vegetation map showing the isolated green patches of spruce fir forest on the highest peaks, and the hydrological map showing the watershed of the Discovery Gully. The two did not overlap. They were separate worlds. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Could an animal have carried it? A bird? A bear? Unlikely over such a distance and to such a specific buried location. Could the pollen have blown there? Possible for a few grains, but not for the concentrated sample she had extracted from a sealed compartment. The conclusion was as elegant as it was chilling. "This is impossible," she whispered to the empty lab. "Unless—" The thought completed itself with cold, stark clarity. Unless it wasn't a natural process. The GPS unit hadn't been lost. Marie, it hadn't washed down a stream. It had been carried. It had been taken from a primary location, a high-altitude spruce fir forest, and deliberately planted in that gully, miles away, in a different watershed, in a different ecosystem. It was a calculated act of misdirection, a planted clue designed to send searchers on a wild goose chase away from the real scene. The report landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Rossi was new to the region, but not to cold cases. She had a reputation for a relentless, methodical mind that saw patterns others missed. She read Dr. Sharma's 4-page report once, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she read it again slowly, letting the weight of each sentence sink in, the pollen analysis, the hydrological data, the final, a stark conclusion. The location of the recovered GPS unit is inconsistent with natural deposition from the environment indicated by palynological evidence. Human intervention is the most probable explanation for its placement. Rossi leaned back in her chair, the squeak of the leather loud in the quiet office. The entire foundation of the Hayes case, the narrative that had stood for 7 years, crumbled to dust in that moment. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a story of a man and his daughter getting lost in the woods. The presence of a deliberately planted clue meant the presence of a third person. It meant deception. It meant that from the very beginning, this was never a search and rescue operation. It was a homicide investigation that hadn't known it was one. The ghost they had been hunting for 7 years suddenly had a human face, and Rossi knew her job was to find it. Detective Rossi's office transformed. The old case files were brought out of storage, but the centerpiece of the new investigation was a 6-foot-wide topographical map of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, pinned to a massive corkboard. Rossi, flanked by a small team of hand-picked investigators, stood before it. With a red marker, she drew a circle around the small, isolated patches of green that Dr. Sharma's report had identified as spruce fir forest. The highest peaks, places like Klingman's Dome, Mount LeConte, Mount Guyot. Everything we thought we knew is wrong, Rossi said, her voice sharp and clear. The search was focused here. She gestured to the vast lower elevation areas where the original search had concentrated because they were looking for someone who was lost. But our subject wasn't lost. The incident, whatever it was, happened here. She tapped the red circle. In the high country, the killer, and we have to call them a killer now, planted the GPS down here to pull the search away from the real location. The new theory was simple. The primary crime scene was in a spruce fir forest. The challenge was that these zones, while limited, were still vast, remote, and brutally rugged. They couldn't simply launch a new search. They needed to narrow the target. Rossi's new methodology was a deep dive into the driest of paper trails. She dispatched 2 junior detectives to the county courthouses in Sevier and Swain counties with a singular mission: identify every piece of privately owned land, every in holding. Every long-term lease or special use permit that bordered or fell within those high-altitude zones, going back 10 years. It was a grueling task, a journey into dusty, leather-bound plat books, handwritten deeds, and disorganized filing cabinets. They were building a new map, a ghost map of human ownership and access rights laid over the natural terrain. For days, the only progress was the accumulation of paper. They cross-referenced property owner names with criminal databases and park violation records looking for any connection, however tenuous. After a week of painstaking work, one property stood out. It was a 20-acre parcel deep within the park boundaries, a grandfathered in-holding that had been in the Crow family for a century. On it sat a small, dilapidated hunting cabin. The property was located at an elevation of 5,200 feet, aimed squarely within a prime spruce fir zone, and was accessible only by a long-abandoned, unmaintained logging road. The Crow family, now wealthy and living in Florida, confirmed they hadn't used the cabin in over a decade. They had, however, employed a local man as a part-time caretaker to check on it once or twice a year. The name they provided was Caleb Crow, a distant cousin. A new targeted search was authorized. Rossi led a small, specialized team, a forensic anthropologist, a K-9 unit trained in cadaver detection, and 2 seasoned park rangers. The drive up the logging road was brutal, requiring high-clearance 4x4s. The final mile they had to cover on foot, the air growing thin and cool. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing, looking like it was being slowly swallowed by the forest. It was dilapidated, its porch sagging, windows boarded up. The dog gave the first indication, whining and pawing at a spot of ground near an old, stone-lined well about 50 yards behind the cabin. The spot was slightly sunken, the soil looser than the surrounding hard-packed earth. The team began to excavate, carefully removing the layers of soil and leaf litter. Less than 2 feet down they found him. The skeletal remains were arranged in a shallow, makeshift grave. The forensic anthropologist did a quick field assessment. The skeleton was consistent with an adult male. It was a grim, somber discovery, the first solid answer in 7 years. They had found Ethan Hayes. But as they expanded the excavation to process the entire scene, one of the rangers, sifting through the soil near the edge of the grave, felt something solid. He carefully brushed the dirt away. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover warped and stained but intact, protected by the oil in the leather, and next to it, nestled in the dirt, was a small object carved from wood, a bird. Rossi felt a jolt of ice in her veins. She remembered the detail from her initial review of the case file, a note from Sarah Hayes's first interview. Lily's favorite toy, a wooden bird, always in her pocket. They had found Ethan, but they had also found the key to everything else. The hunt for the shadow now had a laser focus. Back in her office, Rossi and her team, wearing latex gloves, carefully turned the pages of Ethan's recovered journal. It was a moleskin, its pages filled with his elegant script and detailed botanical sketches. The last few entries, dated the day he disappeared, were different. The handwriting was more hurried, the tone shifting from scientific observation to something else. He described their hike, their arrival at the cabin. He wrote of meeting the caretaker, an older man who introduced himself as Caleb. Ethan, ever the botanist, was fascinated. The man, Caleb, seemed to possess a deep, almost mystical knowledge of the local flora. But he was also cagey, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, a paranoid energy humming beneath his quiet demeanor. Then came the pivotal entry. Most peculiar, Ethan had written. Behind the cabin, shielded by a stand of firs, he's cultivating a small garden, not vegetables, a single species, Brugmansia suavolens, angel's trumpet. Beautiful, but highly toxic. Contains scopolamine, atropine. When I identified it, his entire demeanor changed. He became cold. That was the key, Brugmansia, a powerful and illegal to cultivate in many places, deliriant and poison. The motive, previously a complete mystery, began to snap into focus. The first step was to track down the Crow family in Florida again. They were cooperative, but had little information. The arrangement with Caleb Crow was informal, handled through a local property management office in Gatlinburg decades ago. They paid a small annual stipend in cash. They hadn't spoken to Caleb directly in years. Rossi's team tracked down the property management office only to find it had closed down 5 years ago, its owner having retired. The paper trail seemed to evaporate. They spent 2 frustrating days chasing ghosts, trying to find old employee records or financial statements from the defunct company, hitting one dead end after another. The frustration in the incident room was palpable. They were closer than ever, yet the suspect remained a name with no face, no address. The breakthrough came from old-fashioned police work. One of Rossi's detectives, a man who had grown up in the area, suggested they talk to the retired owner of the real estate office, a man named Gerald Fletcher, now living in a nursing home on the outskirts of Sevierville. Rossi and her partner went themselves. Fletcher was 87, his memory a foggy landscape of past decades. But when Rossi mentioned the old Crow cabin and a caretaker, a flicker of recognition appeared in his eyes. "Caleb," he said, his voice raspy. "Odd fellow. Mountain man, born and raised, kept to himself. Always said the park stole his family's soul." He couldn't remember much else, but he had given them the full name, Caleb Crow. Back at the office, they ran the name through state and federal databases. A hit. Caleb Crow, age 68. A handful of minor offenses over the years, trespassing on park land, a DUI in the 90s, but nothing violent. Crucially, the file contained a driver's license photo and a current address in a small, unincorporated community 20 miles from the park. With a name and a face, they began to build a deep profile. They spoke to neighbors. They pulled public records. A picture of the antagonist emerged not as a monster, but as a man hollowed out by loss. Caleb Crow was born and raised in the mountains, in a cabin that his great-grandfather had built. That land, his entire world, had been acquired by the government in the 1930s to create the national park. His family was displaced, a wound that never healed for him. He was a widower. His wife, Elspeth, had died of cancer 9 years before Ethan and Lily's disappearance. Neighbors described their marriage as unusually close, and her death had broken him. They were childless, a fact that multiple sources mentioned as a source of profound, lifelong sorrow for both of them. After Elspeth's death, Caleb had become a recluse, living a solitary Spartan life, subsisting on odd jobs and a small pension. He was a ghost on the edges of society, a man left behind by the modern world, nursing a deep-seated resentment against the park and steeped in a private grief from which he had never emerged. The motive was no longer about a simple drug bust. It was something far more complex and tragic, rooted in a desperate, misguided opportunism born from a place of unbearable loneliness. Detective Rossi and her partner, a stoic TBI agent named Frank Miller, drove down a quiet country lane, the GPS directing them to a small, immaculately kept house set back from the road. It was a world away from the decaying cabin in the mountains. A tidy vegetable garden grew in the front yard, and rows of vibrant flowers lined the walkway. They found Caleb Crow on his knees, in a flower bed tending to a patch of roses. He was smaller and more frail than his old driver's license photo suggested, his face a roadmap of quiet sorrow. He looked up as they approached, his eyes showing no surprise, only a deep, weary resignation, as if he had been expecting them for 7 years. He slowly got to his feet, wiped his dirt-stained hands on his pants, and said, "Ma, you'd best come inside." The house was as neat as the garden, almost unnervingly so. It felt less like a home and more like a shrine, with every surface polished and every object in its proper place. They sat at a small kitchen table. Rosie didn't begin with accusations. She laid out the facts calmly, her voice even. "We found the cabin, Caleb. We found Ethan Hayes, and we found his journal." She slid a photograph of the Brugmansia plant across the table. "He wrote about your garden. He knew what it was." Caleb stared at the photo, his hands resting on the table, perfectly still. He listened without interruption as Rossi detailed the evidence they had, the chain of logic that had led them to his door. When she was finished, a long silence filled the room. Then Caleb took a slow, deep breath and began to speak, his voice soft and raspy, the accent thick with the old cadence of the mountains. He confessed. He told them how Ethan and Lily had stumbled upon the cabin by accident, how Ethan, with his botanist's eye, had immediately recognized the angel's trumpet. Caleb had panicked. The plants were his private medicine, a way to manage the pain in his joints and the deeper pain in his soul. He couldn't let this stranger report him. He didn't mean any harm. He brewed Ethan a cup of tea, a calming tea, he called it, laced with a small, controlled amount of the flower. He'd done it before. It was just meant to confuse him, to muddle his memory of the place so Caleb could disappear. But he misjudged the dose, or Ethan had a hidden weakness. The man had a violent reaction, clutching his chest, his heart giving out in a matter of minutes. It was an accident. A terrible, stupid accident. Terrified, Caleb buried the body behind the cabin. But there was the girl, the little girl, Lily, who had seen everything. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't kill her. So he took her. He drove for hours that night, down out of the mountains, and hiked into a remote gully where he planted the GPS, a desperate, flawed piece of misdirection. The primary mystery was solved. A wave of tragic resolution washed over Rossi. It was a story of panic and accident, not malice. It felt complete. The long, agonizing question had been answered, but one piece remained. Rossi leaned forward, her voice softening. "So what happened to Lily?" she asked, her mind bracing for a second grim story, a child abandoned, a second accidental death. "Where is she, Caleb?" For the first time, Caleb's expression changed. The weary resignation melted away, replaced by a look of strange, gentle serenity. A faint smile touched his lips. "She's not Lily anymore," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's been Elspeth for 7 years. He nodded his head toward a closed bedroom door at the end of the hall. "My Elspeth came back to me." The air in the kitchen turned to ice. Rossi and Miller exchanged a look of pure, cold shock. As if on cue, the bedroom door creaked open. A girl stood in the doorway, blinking in the light. She was about 13 years old, with long brown hair and wide, curious eyes. Her father's eyes. She looked from the two strangers to the old man at the table. "Papa?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Is everything okay?" The sound of her voice shattered the frozen silence. The second barrel of the reveal had fired, its impact more devastating than any bullet. The child wasn't dead. She hadn't been lost to the wilderness or to a tragic accident. She had been stolen, her name, her history, her very identity erased and overwritten by a grieving old man who had decided to resurrect his dead wife in the body of a lost little girl. The recovery was not a scene from a movie. There were no joyful tears, no dramatic embrace. The girl who called herself Elspeth was taken into the gentle but firm custody of a state child psychologist. She was terrified and confused, ripped from the only home and the only parent she could remember. Sarah was flown in on a state police helicopter, her heart a frantic, hopeful drum against her ribs. The reunion took place in a quiet, neutral-colored room at a TBI facility. When Sarah walked in, she saw her daughter. And the 7 years fell away, and she saw the 6-year-old with the missing front teeth. But the girl who stood before her was a stranger, a teenager who stared at her with fear and suspicion, who flinched when Sarah reached out a hand. Sarah began to weep, a storm of grief and relief, and a new, unimagined pain. She had her daughter back, but she had lost her. The reunion was not an ending, it was the beginning of a new, impossibly painful journey. Caleb Crow's legal fate was quiet and procedural. He confessed to everything, his story never wavering. His defense attorney argued for the accidental nature of Ethan's death, painting a picture of a panicked, grieving old man, not a cold-blooded killer. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter for Ethan's death. But for the kidnapping and 7 years of imprisonment and psychological abuse of Lily, the judge was unsparing. He was sentenced to life in prison, a quiet, legalistic conclusion that ensured he would die behind bars, a finality that felt both just and strangely inadequate to the scale of the chaos he had wrought. The aftermath for Sarah was a landscape of profound and complicated grief. The world celebrated a miracle, but she lived inside its fractured reality. She had Lily back, but the little girl who loved wooden birds and gummy bears was a ghost. In her place was Elspeth, a traumatized 13-year-old who now had to mourn the loss of her captor, the only father she knew. She had to unlearn a lifetime of memories and confront a past she couldn't remember. Sarah, in turn, had to grieve her husband all over again, and the finality of his death now a concrete fact. She had to learn to be a mother to a stranger who was also her flesh and blood. The victory of finding her daughter felt, in the quiet moments, like a new kind of loss. The simple, clean lines of her 7-year vigil had been replaced by a messy, painful, and deeply complicated present. Months later, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch of Sarah's house. She sat in a rocking chair, a cool glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. Beside her, in another chair, sat the girl. They had settled on a new name for her, Laya, a compromise, a bridge between the ghost of Lily and the phantom of Elspeth. Leah wasn't talking much. She rarely did. She was sketching in a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't a bird. It was a detailed drawing of the house across the street, a study in angles and shadows. Sarah watched her, her heart a dull ache. In the line of Leah's jaw, she saw Ethan. In the way she held her pencil, she saw a flicker of the focused 6-year-old she had lost. But the eyes that occasionally glanced up were still wary, still the eyes of a stranger. There was no grand healing, no cinematic breakthrough. There was only this, the shared quiet space on a porch. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with the unspoken weight of all that was stolen, all that was found, and all that could never be recovered. Justice had been served, and a miracle had occurred, but healing was not a destination. It was the long, slow, uncertain walk home, a journey they were only just beginning, step by difficult step together.